Okay, that's working, and that's blinking at me, so I know it's working. Okay. Baruch atah Yahweh Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu leshmoah kol shofar. Blessed are you, Yahweh Eloheinu, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by his commandments and commanded us to hear and respond to the call of the shofar. Isn't that neat? I can play the same note exactly the same way every time. Fathers, we come before you this day on your Shabbat. This Shabbat during this feast of Sukkot. Father, we pray that you would give everybody wisdom and understanding as they come to your word, to study your word and to learn what you would want us to know this day. Guide us into all truth through your word. B'Shem Yehoshua. Amen. And since we are now going to be finishing the book of Deuteronomy, we'll be in chapter 33, starting in verse 1 through chapter 34 in verse 12. The HAFTARAH will be in 1 Kings. And I guess I'm going to have to go look it up because I forgot to write down. No, it's in chapter 8, verses 57 through 66. I didn't forget. I just thought I did. And the name of the reading starting in verse 33, it is Vezot Habracha, and that comes from the verse sentence there. It said, "And this is the blessing with which Moshe, the man of Ha-Elohim, blessed the sons of Israel before his death." And in verse 2 it says, "And he said, Yahweh came from Sinai." That word Sinai, or Sinai, depending on how people say it, is number 5514. The word means thorny, Thorny, thorny. It dawned on them from Seir. Seir, of course, is the number 8165. Sair, it means hairy or shaggy. And then it says he shone forth from Mount Paran. That shone forth is the number 3313. The Hebrew word is Hophia, and it means to shine or to bring light. And then, of course, Mount Paran is Mihar, or Mount Mihar Paran. And in Paran 6290, it means the mountains of caverns. If you remember, there was a cave on that mount that Elisha hid in at one time. I told you the word Sinai was the number 5514. Another name for this mountain range is also called, it is Horeb, where Horeb is. And if you remember, when Moshe was down in Midian, he went up to this mountain and he talked to Yahweh in the bush. And the word bush is the word Sinai. 5572 comes from the Sinai, or Sinai, the thorny. So this was a bramble or a thorny bush where Moshe first talked to Yahweh from. If we go to Exodus chapter 3, in verse 1 and 2, it said, "Now Moshe kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of Elohim. And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, but the bush was not consumed." if we kind of put this in with some of the meanings of the words that we just looked at, you might say Moshe first saw Yahweh as a fiery thorn bush on the mountain of Horeb, on the backside of the desert in Midian in Arabia. From this mountain of revelation, Yahweh rose up like the sun, bringing light to the people. He called them to serve him and to walk in his light. He then brought them out of Egypt, or bondage, to himself. He gave them instructions in the wilderness on how to live as a free people. Then he brought them into the land of promise. Kind of an interesting concept when you begin to think of it in those terms and just look up what the words and everything mean and the simplicity with which the Hebrew speaks of him. In verse 3, well, actually, he's shown forth from Mount Paran. It says he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand, a fiery law for them. That word law there is a number 1881. It's not the word Torah. It's the Hebrew word doth, and it really means a royal edict. And of course we know that that royal edict was the Torah. And he came with 10,000 of his saints. He came with 10,000 of his saints. He brought them out of bondage. And he brought them down, into Horeb. And then he came from there back up into the promised land. In the Jude it talks about, him coming with thousands or 10,000 of his saints. And it's a reference back to something that Enoch said or did. In Revelation we see him with all the saints coming back. It all started with Moshe there in that thorny bush on Mount Horeb in the land of Midian. In verse 3 he said, yes, he loves his people, or loves the people. All his saints in your hand. They sit down at your feet, receiving your words. That word sit down is the number 8497. It means to encamp at your feet. Regiel, 7272 is the word there, it's translated feet. And it's saying that receiving your words are, that word receive is 5375. Nasa means to lift, or to bear, or to carry, or to take, to accept his words. We all have the opportunity to accept his words, lift up his words, to carry his words. That word is the Mashiach, so we can lift up, we can carry the Mashiach. We can, walk in the same thing he walked in. Go to Proverbs chapter 4 in verses 20 through 22 of Proverbs chapter 4. In verse 20 of Proverbs 4, he said, my son, give attention to my words, incline your ear to my sayings. Do not let them depart from your eyes. Keep them in the midst of your heart. For they are life to those who find them, and health to all their flesh. The implication there, their life to those who find them, the implication is they are hidden, and you must be searching for the truth in order to find what these words say and where they are. Go back to verses 4 and 5 of this same chapter 4. It says, he also taught me and said to me, let your heart retain my words, keep my commands, and live. And then in verse 5 it says, get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget nor turn away from the words of my mouth. If we go to the book of Luke in chapter 10, in verse 38 through 42 of this passage. He said, "Now it happened as they went that he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Miriam, who also sat at Yehoshua's feet and heard his word. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she approached him and said, 'Master, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore tell her to help me.' Yehoshua answered and said to her, 'Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Miriam has chosen that good part which will not be taken away from her. She has chosen to sit at his feet to hear and receive his words.'" We must understand and walk in his words in order to receive the blessings given in his word. Go to Psalm 111. In Psalm 111, in verse 10. If everybody gets a hold of this one little verse and what it's really saying, it opens up so much truth to them. The fear of Yahweh, or reverence of Yahweh, is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all those doing his commandments or his will. His praise endures forever. If we go to Psalm 119, in verse 99, actually in verse 99 and 100, he said, "I have more understanding than all my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the ancients, because I keep your precepts." Understanding comes with doing what the word says. There's so many people out there who think sometimes, well, when I understand it, then I'll do it. The understanding never comes, so they never do. But when you start doing it just because his word said to do it, then the understanding will come with the doing. The doing of it also causes that word to become part of who you are. Not a matter of trying to memorize what it is, just a matter of doing what it says, and then you become one with the word because you did it. In verse 104 of that same Psalm 119, he says, "Through your precepts I get understanding." His word gives us understanding. Once we have the understanding, it's just like he said there then, "Therefore I hate every false way." If we go down to verse 130, it says, "The entrance of your words gives light. It gives understanding to the simple." I know many people, they just read over things. They read over the scriptures, but since they don't ever do them, then actually these scriptures don't ever enter them and become part of who they are. The entrance of your words is done through the doing of what the word says do. And then we have understanding. Go back to Deuteronomy 33, there again in verse 3. He's talking about sitting down, receiving your words. If you'll notice, this is talking the people, and he says he loves the people. It's talking about the 12 tribes and all of those who have chosen to sojourn with them. These divine laws and instructions were given to Israel, but in reality they were to be a light to all the nations. Go all the way back to Deuteronomy 7. In verses 7, 8, and 9. In Deuteronomy 7:7 it says, "Yahweh did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the least of all peoples. But because Yahweh loves you and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers, Yahweh has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Therefore know that Yahweh Eloheka, he is El, the faithful El, who keeps covenant and mercy for 1,000 generations with those who love him and keep his commandments. Doesn't make any difference who you are. Go back to Deuteronomy 4. In verse 5 through 8. In verse 5 of Deuteronomy 4 it says, Surely I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as Yahweh Elohei commanded me that you should do them in the land which you go to possess. Therefore keep, 8104, Shamar, and do, 6213. For this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has Elohim so near to it as Yahweh Eloheinu is to us, for whatever we may call upon him? And what great nation that has such statutes and righteous judgments as are in all this Torah, which I set before you this day? He goes back, in reality he's saying, be a doer, not a hearer only. That's the same thing that we're told in the book of James. So go back to 33 and verse 4. He says, Moses commanded a law, that's the number 8451, a Torah, an instruction for us. And then it says it's a heritage. Really that word heritage is the number 4181. It means a possession. Moses commanded the Torah for us, a possession of the congregation of Yaakov. The word for Torah, 8451, it comes from 3884, Yarah. This word means to flow as water. It means to shoot as an arrow. It means to point out or to teach. All of his instructions are to teach us and correct us in our walk of righteousness in order to become imitators of the Mashiach, to do what he did. This word heritage, this 4181, is the word morashah. It actually means a possession. If we go to Ephesians chapter 2, in verse 11 and 12, in verse 11, Rav Shaul writes, and he says, Therefore remember that you, once Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision made in the flesh by hands. Now whether he's talking to the house of Israel who had chosen to walk disobedient to Yahweh's word and became part of the nations of the world and then were called Gentiles, uncircumcised, or whether it's the people who were uncircumcised, just regular Gentiles who had no association with the house of Israel whatsoever. Verse 12 said that at that time you were without the Mashiach, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without Elohim in the world. Now go to Romans 9. In verses 3 through 5. And again Rav Shaul is talking. And this time he's specifically talking about his brethren, the house of Israel. For I could wish that I myself were accursed from the Mashiach. I'm in verse 3 of Romans 9. I could wish that I myself were accursed from the Mashiach for my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh, who are Israelites, to whom is the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the Torah, the service of Elohim, and the promises. of whom are the fathers, and from whom, according to the flesh, the Mashiach came, who is over all, the eternally blessed Yahweh. Amen. Go back to 33, Deuteronomy 33 and verse 5. It said that he was king in Yeshurun. That word Yeshurun is the number 3484. The word means the upright. Not really the name of the place, but he was the king in the upright, or in those who are upright. It's a symbolic name or title for Israel in their uprightness or in their obedience. He was king in Jerusalem, in Yeshurun, the upright, when the leaders of the people were gathered, all the tribes of Israel together. That word tribes there is in number 7626. The word is shebet. It means tribe, but it also means sticks. Later on, in Ezekiel, it talks about the combining of all the sticks into one. So all the tribes, all the sticks are going to be combined into one. In verse 6, now remember it started out here, this is the blessing, and Moses is going to be talking about blessing each of the different descendants of Israel, and they were the patriarchs of the tribes. Verse 6 is that let Reuben live and not die. Nor let his men be few. It's a prayer for Reuben. Jacob had prophesied of Reuben back in Genesis 49, and he was talking about he would not excel in anything. I think Moses here is saying, in this passage, let Reuben live and not die. Let not his men be few. He's saying let him have descendants, is what he's really asking for. In verse 7, remember Genesis, the Reuben 7205 is the number for the name Reuben. It means see a son. Now in verse 7, and this he said of Judah. Hear Yahweh, the voice of Judah, and bring him to his people. Let his hands be sufficient for him, and may you be a help against his enemies. Back in Genesis 49, Jacob said, that the lion, the king, would come from the tribe of Judah. And the word Judah itself is the number 3063. It means celebrated or praised, or to celebrate or to praise Yahweh. In verse 8 it says, and of Levi, he said, or Levi. Again, back in Genesis 49, according to Jacob, they were going to be scattered, but they were also going to be blessed, it says in Numbers 25. Go to Numbers 25, verse 11. Now, in this verse, Phinehas, who was the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, had performed an act which most people today would think was very bad, and he killed two people who were in direct disobedience to Yahweh's word in front of everybody. It says, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the sons of Israel, because he was zealous with my zeal among them, so that I did not consume the sons of Israel in my zeal. Therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him a covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for Eloah and made atonement for the sons of Israel. Go to Exodus 32. In verse 26 of Exodus 32, this is after the incident with the golden calf. And in verse 26 it said, Then Moshe stood in the entrance of the camp and said, Whoever is on Yahweh's side, to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together to him. So they all came together to him to be on the side of Yahweh. And then in Deuteronomy 10, in verse 8, it says, At that time Yahweh separated or set apart the tribe of Levi to bear the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, to stand before Yahweh, to minister to him, and to bless in his name to this day. So, and then it goes on in verse 9, Therefore Levi has no portion nor inheritance with his brethren. Yahweh is his inheritance, just as Yahweh Eloheka promised him. So going back in Deuteronomy 33, continuing on Levi, he said, Let your Tumim and your Urim be with your Holy One. The Tumim and the Urim is the lights and the perfection. These were the stones that were kept in the breast pocket that was worn on the breast of Aaron. And he said, Let your Tumim and your Urim be with your Holy One, whom you tested at Massah, and with whom you contended at the waters of Meribah. Who says of his father and mother, I have not seen them. Nor did he acknowledge his brothers or know his own children, for they have observed your word and kept your covenant. He did not know his brothers or his own children. You know, back in Exodus 26, where we were reading a little while ago, is where, you know, they went through and they killed all their brothers and sisters with a sword, you know, those who had defiled themselves with a golden calf. And in Matthew 10, in Matthew chapter 10, in verse 37, Messiah himself is speaking. He says, And he who does not take his, in verse 30, He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He's not saying you're supposed to hate them, but you're supposed to care enough about him that you follow him, and then showing to your brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers what you would do to, you know, in regards to Messiah, and then that would bring them, hopefully, to him also. Same way, go to Luke 14. In Luke 14 and in verse 21, in verse 26. Now in verse 25 it says, Great multitudes went with him, and he turned and said to them, verse 26, If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. That really sounds awfully strange as far as saying, you know, that they don't hate their father and mother, wife and children. But it means to love them less than him is what it's really referring to. Now back in verse 10 of Deuteronomy 33, and he's still talking about Levi. He says, They shall teach Yaakov your judgments, and Israel your Torah. They shall put incense before you, and a whole burnt sacrifice on your altar. Bless his substance, Yahweh. This is a prayer he prayed for Levi. And accept the work of his hands. Strike the loins of those who rise up against him, or who rise against him, and of those who hate him, that they rise not again. Remember, he's praying that Yahweh will take vengeance against those who come against the Levites. If you go to the book of Malachi, in chapter 2, in verses 1 through 7. He says, "And now, O priest," in verse 1, Malachi 2, "this commandment is for you. If you will not hear it, and if you will not take it to heart, to give glory to my name, says Yahweh Sabaoth, I will send a curse upon you, and I will curse your blessings. Yes, I have cursed them already, because you do not take it to heart." There's so many people today that really don't take the word of Yahweh seriously. It's more like fun and games. I think that they think sometimes, well, as long as I'm sitting under the word, whether I listen or do it or anything else, at least I'm not out doing something else bad. They don't always recognize the fact that the word is their life when they do it. In verse 3 he said, "Behold, I will rebuke your descendants and spread dung on your faces, the dung of your solemn feast, and one will take you away with it. Then you shall know that I have sent this commandment to you, that my covenant with Levi may continue, says Yahweh Sabaoth. My covenant was with him, one of life and peace, and I gave him to him, that he might fear me," is the implication. So he feared me, and was reverent before my name. The law of truth was in his mouth, injustice was not found on his lips. He walked with me in peace and equity, and turned many away from iniquity. Verse 7 is rather the key in this passage. "For the lips of a priest should keep knowledge, and people," it's implied, "should seek the Torah from his mouth, for he is the messenger of Yahweh Sabaoth." The priests were the ones who were supposed to speak the words of Yahweh to all the people and teach them all the precepts and concepts. They are to teach Israel. Going back to Deuteronomy 33, in verse 12, now we're talking about Benjamin, what people call Benjamin, or Benjamin. Of Benjamin he said, "The beloved of Yahweh shall dwell in safety by him. You shelters him all the day long, and he shall dwell between his shoulders." Benjamin, or Benjamin, the land that he received was between the kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel, there on the northern border. Just, I think the borderline cuts through across the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But Ezekiel 48, in Ezekiel 48 and in verse 22. Now this is in the future, when the land is reallocated then among all the tribes. In verse 22 it says, "Moreover, apart from the possession of the Levites and the possession of the city, which are in the midst of what belongs to the prince, the area between the border of Judah and the border of Benjamin shall belong to the prince." So the prince is going to own the land between Judah and the border of Benjamin. That would again be that area that goes through the Temple Mount there, where the temple, was in Jerusalem. Of course, Benjamin, the numbers 1144, it actually means the son of my right hand. So the temple itself here seems to be in Benjamin, where the courts are in the tribe of Judah. Go back in verse 13 of chapter 33. "And of Joseph he said," remember through Joseph, and remember Joseph 31:30, it means Yah has added. the future tense of the name, and it's referring to Ephraim and Manasseh, the two sons of Joseph. Now 3130 is a future tense of 3254, which is the name Yosef, or Yosef. And of course, Ephraim and Manasseh, Ephraim means double fruit, and Manasseh means causing to forget. This 3254, the tense of the word Yosef, the root word, it means to add, that is, to continue to add. Now, just before we read, starting in verse 13, the blessing of Joseph, go to Genesis 48. Remember, in verse 19 of Genesis 48, it's talking about the two sons of Joseph, and he had brought them to be blessed by his father. And in verse 19, Yaakov said, but his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know, he also shall become a people, and he also shall be great, but truly his younger brothers shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become the Melogoyim, or the multitudes of the nations, or the fullness of the Gentiles. Referring to those two. Now go back to Genesis 27. (27, 28, and 29). This is the blessing that Yitzhak placed on Yaakov. Verse 27, and he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his clothing, and blessed him, and said, surely the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which Yahweh has blessed. Therefore may Elohim give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. This was the one that went to Yaakov. Yaakov then adopted the two sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, and all of these blessings passed to them. Going back to Deuteronomy now, in verse 13 rather, and of Joseph he said, blessed of Yahweh is his land, with the precious things of heaven, with the dew and the deep lying beneath, with the precious fruits of the sun, with the precious produce of the months, with the best things of the ancient mountains, with the precious things of the everlasting hills, with the precious things of the earth and its fullness, and the favor of him who dwelt in the bush. The favor of him who dwelt in the bush. Let the blessing implied come on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. His glory is like a firstborn bull, his horns are like the horns of the wild ox. Together with them he shall push the peoples to the ends of the earth. They are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. This land goes back in verse 15, the precious things of the everlasting hills, the ancient mountains. All of this land is what they call today the West Bank, and they're trying to give it away to create a Palestinian state in the heartland of the nation of Israel. That land which Yahweh blessed to Ephraim and Manasseh. Verse 18. And of Zebulun he said, rejoice, Zebulun, in your going out, and Issachar in your tents. They shall call the people to the mountain. There they shall offer sacrifices of righteousness. For they shall partake of the abundance of the seas, and treasures hidden in the sand. The word Zebulun, the number 2074. Means a dwelling place. The word, it can also mean her husband will dwell with her. And then the word Issachar, of course Issachar, you know, is 3485, meaning he will bring a reward. These two tribes in the northern part of Israel, north of what we would call northern Galilee, the dwelling place, her husband dwelling with her, and Issachar meaning he will bring a reward. Go back to Isaiah chapter 9, or go over to Isaiah chapter 9. In Isaiah 9, in verse 1 and 2, it said, "Nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed, as when at first he lightly esteemed the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward more heavily oppressed her by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, in Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined." Go to Matthew chapter 4. In Matthew chapter 4, starting in verse 12. Verse 12 of Matthew 4 said, "Now when Yehoshua heard that Yochanan had been put in prison, he departed to Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capharnaum, which is by the sea, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness saw a great light, and upon those who sat in the region and shadow of death light has dawned." From that time Yehoshua began to preach and to say, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand," or is drawing near. Remember, this passage that's quoting here from Isaiah chapter 9 is the reason why he departed to go to Galilee, so that this prophecy would actually come to pass. If we go back, Issachar, in your tents, Issachar in your tents there, referring to maybe a peaceful life. If you go to 1 Chronicles chapter 12, in verse 32, he's talking about all those from the different tribes that were equipped to go to war and different things. But in verse 32 it said, "Of the sons of Issachar, who had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do. Their chiefs were 200, and all their brethren were at their command." It's like these are the ones who understood, they knew what needed to be done. They would command the others, and they would go perform. Of the others, there were valiant men and soldiers and warriors and so forth, but somebody has to direct all that. And these are the sons of Issachar who had understanding of the times, knew what people needed to do. Go to Matthew 16. In Matthew chapter 16, in verses 1 through 4, he said, Then the Pharisees and the Sadducees came and testing him asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, When it's evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. In the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. You hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot, implied as discern, the signs of the times. Because they couldn't discern the sign of the time, then in verse 4 it says, A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. It's up to us to be able to discern the signs of the times and see what's happening and know what's going on in the world. It doesn't have to dictate what you do. You do according to what the Word says. But you have understanding of what's going on, which helps you apply the Word in your life. Go back to Deuteronomy. The rest of what it talks about here is, in verse 18, Rejoice, Zebulun, in your going out, Issachar in your tents. Verse 19, They shall call the people to the mountain. There they shall offer sacrifices of righteousness, for they shall partake of the abundance of the seas, of the treasures hidden in the sand. And then in verse 20 it says, And of Gad he said, remember Gad means a troop. Blessed is he who enlarges Gad. He dwells as a lion and tears the arm and the crown of his head. He provided the first part for himself because a lawgiver's portion was reserved there. He came with the heads of the people. He administered the justice of Yahweh and his judgments with Israel. If you go to Numbers chapter 32, in verse 1, it said, Now the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad had a very great multitude of livestock, and when they saw the land of Yazir and the land of Gilead, that indeed the region was a place for livestock, the sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben came and spoke to Moshe, to Eleazar the priest, and to the leaders of the congregation, saying, Ataroth, Dibon, Yazir, Nimrah, Heshbon, Elealeh, Shebam, Nebo, and Beon. The country which Yahweh defeated before the congregation of Israel is a land for livestock, and your servants have livestock. Therefore they said, If we have found favor in your sight, then let this land be given to your servants as a possession, and do not take us over the Jordan. We all know that Moses gave them the land there on the eastern side of the Jordan River. In this land, Nebo and so forth, it's the same place where Moshe died and was gathered to his people. That's why in verse 21 it says, He provided the first part for himself, Gad, there, because a lawgiver's portion was reserved there. That's why Yahweh gave the land, allowed him to give the land to Gad, because he knew in advance that Moshe was going to be there. In verse 22 it says, And of Dan he said, Dan is a lion's whelp, he shall leap from Bashan. Dan is a lion's whelp. Go to Joshua chapter 19, book of Yehoshua. Chapter 19. Starting in verse 40. In verse 40 it said, The seventh lot came out for the tribe of the children of Dan. Now these were where they were receiving their inheritance in the land, The seventh lot came out for the tribe of the children of Dan, of the sons of Dan, according to their families. And the territory of their inheritance was Zorah, Eshtaol, Shemesh, Sha'alabim, Ajalon, Yethla, Elon, Timnah, Ekron, Eltekeh, Gibbethon, Baalat, Yahud, Beni Barak, Goth Rimmon, Me Yachon, and Rachon with the region near Jaffa, or over against Jaffa, which is on the Mediterranean coast. And the border of the sons of Dan went beyond these, because the sons of Dan went up to fight against Lashem and took it. And they struck it with the edge of the sword, took possession of it, and dwelt in it. They called Lashem Dan, after the name of Dan their father. This is the inheritance of the tribe of the sons of Dan according to their families, these cities with their villages. That Lashem that he took, the word Lashem is 3959. It means precious stone. If you remember, Samson was a Danite, one of the judges of Israel. Go back to verse 23 of Deuteronomy 33. It said, and of Naphtali he said, remember Naphtali, the number is 53:21, means my wrestling. O Naphtali, satisfied with favor and full of the blessing of Yahweh, possess the west and the south. That word satisfied means satiated with favor, satiated with the blessing of Yahweh. That word favor there is a number 75:22. It is the Hebrew word ratzon. Satisfied or satiated or filled with his will. Also given a good land. In verse 24 it says, and of Asher he said. Remember, Asher is 836, means happy. He said, Asher is most blessed of sons, or with sons. Let him be favored by his brothers, and let him dip his foot in oil. Dip his foot, 72:72, in the oil, it's 8081. To dip his foot in the oil, I believe, is to walk in the Word and receive the blessings. He was blessed with descendants. The word oil is 8081, Bashemin. He was blessed with descendants following Yahweh. Verse 25, he said, your sandals shall be iron and bronze, or iron and copper. As your days being long, so shall your strength be. Will be great. That word sandals is the number 4515. The root of it is manal. It's the only place that it's actually used. Literally it means a bolt or a bar. Brown Driver Briggs says it means a shoe. So he's saying he's going to walk in strength and he's going to walk in justice. To do that means that he's going to walk in the Word. Dip his foot in oil. Walk in the Word. And he's saying, may your strength last all your days. Or another way, may your paths be smooth all your days. In verse 26, it said, there is no one like the El of Yeshurun. Remember we talked about Yeshurun as being the upright. There is no one like the El of the upright, who rides the heavens to help you, and in his excellency on the clouds. The eternal El is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. He will thrust out the enemy from before you, and will say, destroy. Then Israel shall dwell in safety, the fountain of Yaakov alone. the fountain of Yaakov. Remember Messiah of Yaakov. Messiah was descendant of Yaakov. Messiah was the fountain of living water. In verse 27, the word destroy. He will thrust out or destroy, and will say destroy. Hashami, the number is 8045, means to make desolate. And again in verse 28, then Israel shall dwell in safety, the fountain of Yaakov alone. In a land of grain and new wine, his heavens shall also drop dew. The word fountain there in verse 28 is the number 5869. It's the Hebrew word een, like E-E-Y-N, een. The root of it is ayin, and it means the eye. The word fountain is as the eye of the landscape, or literally it is saying that which draws the eye. The eye is always on. Israel shall dwell in safety, the fountain of Yaakov, the one which the eye is drawn to. Yahweh said in other places in the Psalms, he said, my eye is always on my people, Israel. And in verse 29 it says, happy are you, O Israel. Who is like you? A people saved by Yahweh. The shield of your help, the sword of your majesty, your enemies shall submit to you, and you shall tread down their high places, or you shall tread down their pagan places of worship. Your enemies shall submit. That word submit is the number 3584. Actually, it means to be found to be liars. So your enemies shall be found to be liars, and therefore they will cringe and cower before you. The Hebrew word itself is the word kakash, like K-A-W-K-A-S-H, kakash. It's a root meaning to be untrue in word and failing to perform in deeds. So the enemies are untrue in word and they fail to perform in deeds. But notice throughout all of these, as we're reading in chapter 33, the blessings that come upon his people in regards to what happens to the rest of the world, and especially those who would come against his people. Now in chapter 34, so then Moshe went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is across from Jericho, and Yahweh showed him all the land of Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea. That, of course, would be the Mediterranean. He's looking towards the Mediterranean from Mount Nebo. The word Nebo is the number 5015. It means prophet. Moshe went up on the mount of the prophet. Remember, he also said, Yahweh did, that he will raise up a prophet like Moshe from among his brethren. So again, it's a reference to Moshe being a prophet. He went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is across from Jericho, and Yahweh showed him all the land of Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the south and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. Actually, the name Jericho, 3405, means its moon, but it's called here the city of palms. Verse 4, then Yahweh said to him, this is the land of which I swore to give Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there. You shall not cross over there. In verse 5, so Moshe, the servant of Yahweh, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of Yahweh. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his grave to this day. Moshe was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor abated or reduced. And the sons of Israel wept for Moshe in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moshe ended. Now Yehoshua ben Nun, Yehoshua, Yahweh's deliverer, the Son of the Eternal, was full of the spirit or breath of wisdom, for Moshe had laid his hands on him. So the sons of Israel heeded him and did as Yahweh had commanded Moshe. But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moshe, whom Yahweh knew face to face. In all the signs and wonders which Yahweh sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. And that concludes the book of Deuteronomy. And for those of you out there listening, and for those